Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled 8 Strategies for Creating Inclusive Classrooms. Our leaders for the session are Lauren S. Cardon, Associate Professor of English, the University of Alabama, and Anne-Marie Womack, Associate Teaching Professor, also Activate Engineering Communication Program at Rice University. Dr. Anne-Marie Womack is an award-winning associate teaching professor at Rice University in engineering communication. She consults with educators across the country on inclusive teaching, including as a co-facilitator of the yearly pedagogy workshop for graduate students here at the National Humanities Center, the Graduate Student Summer Residency, to be exact. Her scholarship appears in journals such as College Composition and Communication, Pedagogy, and Modern Fiction Studies. She co-created the website accessiblesyllabus.com with a group of students at Tulane University, where she formerly served as the Director of Writing. In her 20 years as a college educator, Dr. Womack has won 7 teaching awards. Currently, she is working on a book project titled Teaching with Disability. Dr. Lauren S. Cardon is an Associate Professor of English at the University of Alabama with a PhD from Tulane University. She specializes in DEI pedagogy and has published pedagogical articles in South Atlantic Review, Change, the Magazine for Higher Learning, and the collection Quick Hits, Teaching with Digital Humanities. She co-created the website Teaching Interventions, Scripts and Strategies for Engaging Race in the Classroom. She is also the author of 3 monographs on American literature, most recently, Fashioning Character, Style, Performance, and Identity in Contemporary American Literature with UVA Press. Currently, she is writing an eco-critical project titled A Planet in Hospice, Environmental Justice and Existential Ecofiction. Dr. Cardon has taught at the college level for 22 years, received multiple grants for digital humanities initiatives, and been awarded 2 prestigious teaching fellowships, a Learning in Action Fellowship and a 3-year Distinguished Teaching Fellowship with Technology at the University of Alabama. To all of our teachers who are here tonight, I present to you, without further ado, our speakers for the evening. Lauren and Anne-Marie, thank you for joining us. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Welcome. We are delighted to speak with you today about inclusive teaching. Thanks so much to Mike Williams, Raven Ferguson, Zoe Holl, and Sara Olds at the NHC for facilitating this event. View access notes. As Mike said, the webinar is being auto-captioned. The CC option is available as a tab on your webinar screen. We will describe images in our slides out loud. On screen now is an image of our book, Inclusive College Classrooms. The artwork features a dynamic swirl of acrylic paints, all different colors of the rainbow. We are also distributing an access copy. This is a text version of our talk. You can access it with the QR code on screen or at the link tinyurl.com/ICC, the number 8, and the word strategies. That link is also going in the chat now. We ask that you don't distribute the access copy, but everything we talk about today is discussed in more depth in our book. We're all pretty used to digital environments at this point, and we just want to remind you that these spaces allow us to care for ourselves in unique ways. You can doodle or knit, stem, eat, drink. You can move around, take breaks. Don't worry, you'll miss something because the NHC will post a recording. We also have planned breaks to get feedback and questions from you. If this space creates a barrier for you, please type in the question box or the chat box, and our NHC facilitators will support you in the best way they can.
So why do students check out? When our students check out, faculty often interpret it in a handful of ways. Sometimes we think the student doesn't care, the student is acting entitled, the student's being disrespectful, or the student's lazy. Or in more recent years, and I hear this from colleagues a lot, students haven't been taking classes seriously since COVID. In other words, we often have a tendency to see it as an issue with the student. Now, some faculty believe the problem to be one of rigor. Our students aren't being challenged enough, and they respond by enacting stricter policies on participation or classroom etiquette, as opposed to, say, changing teaching methods or course content. So these are the most common responses that I see in terms of how faculty interpret student disengagement. But the research suggests something different. Researchers in pedagogy and clinical psychology suggest the #1 culprit is a mental health crisis in the US, one that seems worse in academia than in the general population. In a 2018 study, for example, 39% of faculty and staff reported having some type of anxiety, along with 42% of students. Compare these numbers with the general US population, which according to the National Institute of Mental Health is 19% in a given year. A lot of the symptoms of anxiety, fatigue, avoidance, burnout, when students just can't even make themselves care, they kind of illustrate, first of all, why we're seeing this disengagement, but also why rigor, especially with policies, doesn't necessarily help. Now, other studies report the impact of population shock events like a natural disaster or a mass shooting or something that saturates our media and sometimes directly impacts our students' lives. According to numerous studies since COVID, which certainly constitutes a population shock event, anxiety has risen across the population an additional 25%. Another factor worth mentioning, in recent years, many institutions, like my home institution of the University of Alabama, have seen increase in adult learners or non-traditional learners, as well as first-generation students. And as a result, we're seeing new forms of financial stress and pressure among our students. So given that most faculty don't want to play the role of psychologist, at least I know I don't, and nor should we, and that we can't necessarily combat the larger institutional challenges that might be exacerbating student anxiety, how do we engage students in our current climate? So the same research experts have weighed in on what moves we as faculty can make to combat the symptoms of these issues in the classroom. Fostering connections and community, respecting priorities and being flexible, and making engagement part of each class meeting, having students do something. And I noticed it with the opening questions that in the chat, people were mentioning things like hands-on activities or framing the subject in ways that will engage students. And I think that's a part of what these experts are suggesting. So with these 3 recommended moves in mind, Emery and I want to offer 8 actionable strategies for engaging students in your classes and keeping them tuned in. We have 3 primary goals for this talk. First, to promote inclusive teaching practices. Students are more likely to stay engaged if they feel that they belong, if they feel connected to the content and to others in the room, and if they believe they're capable of learning. Number 2, to promote flexibility and useful rigor. To quote historian Kevin Gannon, courses can be difficult intellectually, they can be difficult logistically. We want to challenge our students academically while respecting student priorities and creating a supportive environment. And number 3, to provide specific examples of activities that have been shown to engage more students in the learning process. So now I'd like to invite your participation on a quick poll. I'm going to ask you about a favorite lesson. So we're going to use the Mentimeter app. You can use your smartphone or your computer. You can snap a photo of the QR code on the screen or visit menti.com and use the poll code 5556-4933. So I'd like you to think of a learning experience that you had during college, high school, or even earlier that you found especially enjoyable, memorable, and educational, and describe it in a few words. This could be anything from a field trip, the physics Olympics in high school, anything that you can think of that has really stayed with you. And as you're entering your responses in the poll, consider what made this experience memorable or enjoyable. I'm going to give you all a few moments just to respond. Okay. Starting to see some responses now. Someone mentioned a Jeopardy review game. That is something that someone did when I was in high school, and I remember it being very effective. Games have been shown, we talk about this a bit in our book, games have been shown to engage students by a lot of researchers, including role-playing games like Reacting to the Past, but even something as simple as like an exam review game. I've done this as a study tool. Use of UDLs. See, I'm going to refresh again. Okay, more things are coming up. Field trips, visiting museums, a lot of field trips on here. Going to a play, a field trip where we were engaged with all of our senses. Creating kites after reading The Kite Runner. I love that. Multicultural night. So one thing I'm seeing a lot of is science fair and business fair. I loved science fairs. There are a lot of hands-on and experiential activities here. A lot of things that tend to make students feel as though they're participating in the learning process as opposed to being outsiders or observers. A lot of these are multi-sensory, which I think is interesting as well. And a lot of them just sound very joyful. So I like to ask this question early in a talk because it's a good opportunity to reflect on the extent to which we're incorporating these types of practices, to the extent that we can in our own practice.
So we'll be sharing these responses at the end. We're getting so much good information crowdsourced, but only we'll have a little bit of time to talk about some of them. So traditionally, higher education has focused on students who perform well, the best and the brightest. Scholars study their habits to develop best practices. When students don't live up to this model, it's considered a failure on their part. However, many students don't live up to models because their identities, abilities, and communities have never been included in this traditional vision. Academia has long excluded students based on race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, size, citizenship, and all the different ways these identities overlap, as well as others. Minoritized students describe the frustration, pain, and extra work they have to do in exclusionary higher education environments. Renee Rivera, a disabled student, left one university because, quote, I wanted to be able to get my college degree without having to waste my time and energy fighting to do so. Quick note, if you're wondering why I use the term disabled student, I've written the answer at the bottom of my Access copy, and I'm happy to discuss this more during the Q&A. A student of color at a predominantly white institution asked researchers, how am I supposed to thrive in an environment where I'm already the different odd person out, where the people that are supposed to be helping me learn don't believe in me being here? A transgender student at Rider University explained, I don't want to feel like an afterthought. Exclusion is worse for students who are discriminated against intersectionally. For example, studies show that students are less likely to have disability accommodations if they are students of color, women and gender expansive people, and students who have been systemically impoverished. And Black students with learning disabilities often do not seek accommodation because of fear of racial and disability prejudice. Inclusive teaching seeks to disrupt the systemic inequities in education and in our larger communities. It's an intentional, critical process that supports learning and belonging for all students. My co-author Lauren likes to point out that it requires us to think beyond our own perspective. A teaching method or activity that worked great for you as a student might not always work for learners with different abilities and social contexts. There are many assumptions made about students by us, by our university, and by the educational system at large. These are often the roots of exclusion. So let's consider this question for a moment. What makes a good student? What's a normal student? There are quotation marks around normal because we know there's no true norm. But in popular culture, what do we assume students can and should do? I'll just pause for a moment of reflection. Feel free to offer an answer in chat, but we won't read them. This is just for a moment to think about the question. So our experience is in the college classroom. So your answers may differ based on who you're teaching. But when I ask this question at workshops, college educators often note that students are expected to show up at a certain time to a certain location for class, participate aloud, but not too many times, write in standardized English, buy textbooks, sit in desks that are limited by size and often made for right-handed people, take notes, sometimes by hand if computers are banned in the classroom, work with groups, meet deadlines, etc. If we hold inclusive values, we might be motivated to ask, are all of these things really necessary? As educators, we have to seriously consider our assumptions about learning. We have to examine how these assumptions are embedded in our teaching methods, from the ways we organize the course to the lessons we teach students.
So I'd like to go over our inclusive values for teaching. These are at the root of our practice and the strategies we'll review. We discuss these values at length in our book. So the first is access. Creating access means that we recognize that students have diverse abilities and disabilities, consider how the learning environments we create could exclude students, and create flexible learning conditions to include more students. The second is representation. Prioritizing representation means that we affirm the diversity of experiences and thought that students bring into their education. We introduce diversity of content in the classroom, both in terms of who is studied and who does the studying, who the experts are. And we challenge the biases and prejudices of dominant ideologies that leave some voices unrepresented or underrepresented in academia. In my own field, for example, the literary canon has historically privileged white male authors. And over time, our discipline has adapted with faculty making efforts to include a range of different authors and anthology editors and others doing the same. So the third value is agency. Fostering agency means that we invite students to take responsibility for their education, trust students with genuine choices about the content and assignments, and create an environment in which students can learn from their mistakes. And the fourth is community. Building community means that we nurture relationships with students, foster relationships among students, recognize that learning is an interdependent social process, and examine the relationship between the classroom and communities outside of our academic institutions. Now we'll go over our strategies for inclusive classrooms. And the first is to integrate forward-looking assessment. So this is a term coined by L.D. Fink. In contrast to backward-looking assessments like exams, which require students to look back at what has been covered, with forward-looking assessment, instructors consider what students should be able to do in the future. This is something I talk about in the lecture chapter, which was included in the reading materials for this webinar. The forward-looking assessment begins with backward design. Many of you have probably heard of backward design. It's a concept first introduced by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, and it refers to a process of curriculum development that integrates our learning goals, our assignments, and our in-class instruction. In backward design, instructors begin by identifying what they want students to learn. They then consider how they can determine whether students have achieved these learning goals. And finally, they consider what instructional activities can help students succeed. Forward-looking assessment takes this basic approach but applies it to the whole semester. What is an activity or skill that students could build up to over the course of the semester? So I like to start with the example of the Drake equation, which I learned in my sophomore year astronomy class. Astronomer Frank Drake created this equation to estimate how many civilizations in the galaxy humans on Earth could possibly communicate with. Each variable represents a different estimate, one that requires knowledge and application of astronomical, biological, and chemical information. For example, R, the asterisk, represents the number of stars in the galaxy, a number that no one knows and thus requires educated calculations. Everything we learned that semester taught us how to argue our way through this equation, which later would constitute most of our final exam. So by introducing this equation on the first day, the professor gave us a big picture, a sense of all the things we would learn to work through the equation. During each class session, I knew which part of the equation the information covered would help me solve. I made sure I could understand the content well enough to make my own calculations. In this way, my peers and I were thinking like astronomers. Rather than just memorizing information, we considered how it could help us solve this equation. Outside of class, the equation influenced how I assimilated knowledge, both during the semester and even years later. Moreover, I found this assessment memorable. To this day, I can still rattle off the Drake equation. If you're wondering how you can translate this approach to your discipline, I'd suggest considering things like case studies, simulations, or iterative assignments. I've seen computer science professors revolve a semester around creating something like a Twitter clone. Class units then revolve around skills that will help them build it. I'm going to share an example from my colleague in literature, Emily Whitman, who teaches a world literature course. It's mostly seniors. So this is her course description. In this course, we will read 6 critically acclaimed novels from around the world and investigate how literature arrives on the global stage. This course is run as a literary prize granting committee, loosely based on the Nobel Prize Committee. Every student is a committee member. In this course, it is the students themselves who come up with their own evaluative criteria. Throughout the semester, we will then debate in class and anonymously the merits of the 6 novels. On the last day, students debate and decide which of the novels should win the prize. So framing the class in this way adds a layer of critical inquiry to the reading process. Students aren't just reading the book and seeing if they're into it or not. They're having to think in this additional way about, I'm enjoying this, but how much should that matter? How much does enjoyment matter as a way to evaluate a work of literature? I'm learning something new, or I'm learning about a new culture. Is that something that should be a criterion for this prize? So it just adds this additional layer of complexity, and it demands a little bit more of students. So as this example shows, sometimes creating a forward-looking assessment requires taking a step back from all usual types of assignments and thinking more creatively. There's not an easy example for literature, and Whitman's example is kind of creative to me. Others have used things like anthologies, a digital humanities project, or something where students create their own study tool. The Jeopardy game someone mentioned earlier could be a really fun assessment for someone to create at the end of a semester and at the high school level. So I give these examples to show a range of possibilities and to invite you to consider implementing something similar or reconceptualizing the exam or paper assignment that you're already thinking of using. How might you provide opportunities for students to demonstrate and apply their new knowledge?
Strategy 2, generate multimodal communication. To create an engaging and accessible classroom, one of the most important changes to make is moving from single modes of communication to multiple modes. For example, video captions allow viewers to read information that is audio. Image descriptions enable listeners to hear information that is visual. Simply put, we present information in different modes at the same time. In the classroom, teachers can use this strategy to improve discussions. Many classes require participation, but they can be kind of exclusionary for students who are shy or don't use oral communication as their primary way of communicating. So to include more students, instructors could offer choices on how to participate. A student might speak extemporaneously, write down ideas to read aloud, post in an online forum, or respond on note cards that the instructor collects. Offering choices can encourage higher participation from all students. In the classroom, I also mix up traditional discussions by including accessible visual elements. For example, students whiteboard answers to questions such as, how do we make the hiring process more inclusive? One hand-drawn map that students created lists practices like hire for culture add, not culture fit, and give interviewees questions or topics ahead of time. For whiteboard activities, there are many roles students can play, so not everyone has to write on the whiteboard at once. In our book, we also discuss examples for incorporating drawing into the classroom. When students need an accommodation for the activity, they find images online or use AI. For example, in my disability studies class, students sketched the differences between a retrofit and universal design. A retrofit is a change in an existing structure, like a building, to make it more accessible. In contrast, universal design requires that we build in flexible options for diverse bodies from the beginning. To illustrate these concepts, one student drew a person standing on boxes to reach a microphone. That was the retrofit, compared to a person using an adjustable microphone, which is the far superior universal design. Another student drew a person eating at a restaurant and they found a hair in their food. The retrofit removed the hair. But the universal design was to remake the food hair-free. A lot of creativity comes from getting students to think in different modes. One of the tools I use to engage multiple modes of communication in grading is Otter AI, or really any transcription app. It's an app that records my voice and transcribes my words. When I give feedback on assignments, many students say that it helps to hear my tone of voice, and all students have access to the transcribed text where my words, since they're spoken, convey a more colloquial and exploratory tone. Voice recording technologies in general, though, are not fully inclusive. Research shows that AI transcription technologies are biased against multilingual speakers and Black speakers. This leads to an important point. We have to critically examine any technologies that we bring into the classroom. These are not neutral tools, as we know, and as AI expands in education, we have to challenge how it discriminates and perpetuates bias.
Strategy 3, promote critical thinking. So here I borrow educator Julie Bogart's explanation of critical thinking, which she argues centers on the ability to evaluate evidence, to notice bias as it kicks into gear, to consider a variety of perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable, and then to render a possible verdict, what you believe to be true for now, unquote. Building on Bogart's explanation, critical thinking often entails sitting with something that makes you uncomfortable because it seems to indict you or people like you, or perhaps because it goes against a worldview that you've accepted as gospel. As an educator, I see my role not in necessarily changing students' minds, but in getting them to sit with these ideas and recognizes the biases that shape their worldviews and experiences. And of course, we need to check our own biases. It's an ongoing process. So I want to share 2 types of exercises that I use to promote critical thinking in a way that also keeps me in check. As my students respond, I'm also paying attention to my responses and gut reactions to see where my own biases lie. So in a moment, we're going to do another brief polling exercise. Before we do, I want you to think of one issue or position that you feel like you're firmly committed to. There's nothing anyone could say or do to change your mind about this particular topic. And I'm not going to ask you to share this. This is just for you to keep it in mind. So I'm calling this poll, Consider Alternate Perspectives. So we're going to use the Mentimeter app again. You can use your smartphone or computer, snap a photo of the QR code, or visit menti.com and use the poll code 55564933. So now this part I will ask you to share on our poll. With your firm position in mind, and again, this could be political, social, religious view, I want you to think about what someone would have to do for you to listen to a different perspective on this topic. Not change your mind, but just take them seriously and respectfully hear their position. So I'm going to pause while I wait for some responses. So again, you do not need to share the issue you won't change your mind about, but think about what someone would have to do to get you to listen to their perspective. It took a minute last time, so I am going to wait. if you're getting the same poll, you should see another another slide to click on. Is that right, Emery? Someone in the chat said they're seeing the same poll.
Okay, I will make sure to get to the right slide. Thank you for that.
But I'm seeing some answers in the chat, so I'm going to start responding to these. A few people have said something about kind of using a respectful tone or just offering to share their point of view without seeming to have the aim of changing theirs. I think that I'm seeing that answer a few times now. Now, let's see, I'm going to refresh and see if some are appearing on the poll now. Yeah. Another thing, the objectives, be respectful, support with verifiable facts. They would need to present facts or explanation, give me a good explanation. I like a lot of people are saying, are mentioning facts. I know that sometimes if I'm in a particular headspace and someone sends me like I don't know, an article that may have facts in it, but I already know where this person's coming from, I still won't really take that in. That's my bias speaking. But I see a lot of things about being respectful, calm tone of voice. So I think one thing that's interesting to me when I ask this question, both here and in my classes and at conferences, I'm seeing this on the poll now, is that it has a lot to do with delivery. Although there are a few people saying like they want to hear logic, they want to hear facts, and I do understand that it helps to have both people speaking the language of logic. The more common responses I see have to do with the tone and the delivery. So what I always find that is shared across the board with my students, regardless of how diverse their perspectives are, they all kind of want to be treated in a similar way. They don't want someone using really aggressive rhetoric to change their mind. They want to feel like someone's really interested in hearing their point of view and hearing what they have to say. A lot of people also mention body language and just, speaking at a particular pace, not speaking too quickly. Asking questions is another one I see a lot. So thank you for sharing these. Oh, I like the word empathy or empathetic. A few people have mentioned that. And to me, I think that's especially important when we're talking to someone we know has a different view, because in many cases, you're used to someone coming at you without understanding your own position. So showing empathy, showing you're open to hearing where someone's coming from, I think is a really good starting place for having a productive conversation about a sensitive issue. It's really hard when an issue is close to us, perhaps directly impacts our bodies, the safety of our loved ones, the depths of our spiritual faith, to have a conversation that is fraught with emotion and anxiety. Our students, regardless of their degree of privilege, have those emotionally charged issues too. So one thing I suggest is being vulnerable about our own biases. When I use this exercise at the beginning of the semester, I don't just ask my students to share, I share as well. I talk about my own struggle to hear other points of view on certain issues, which I keep vague, and how I have failed at navigating differences in an effective way. Another takeaway for this first exercise, one thing that often happens is that students who may feel very differently about the same issue often overlap in terms of what gets them to listen. It's a way of finding connection with each other. Sometimes, even when we differ in our politics or social views, we can find common ground in how we want to be treated and spoken to. A final thing I take away from this exercise is emphasizing how it sets the tone for the semester. I ask students to hold it in mind throughout the semester when we have discussions or group work. It's not a denial of emotion, but rather a slowing down, an emphasis on intention and communication. So now I want to share a second exercise I use to promote critical thinking. This exercise it involves what I call master narrative mapping. In my literature class, I might ask students to map out an archetypal immigrant story on the board, or sometimes a white savior narrative or a typical romantic comedy. Students generate what one of these typical narratives looks like. So for the immigrant story, they often say things like, someone is living in poverty in a European country at the turn of the 19th or early 20th century. They are oppressed and they're saving up money for passage to America, and they get on a ship and then they see the Statue of Liberty. They arrive on Ellis Island. They work their way up. It's a rags to riches story, et cetera, et cetera. So importantly, I don't tell them these stories are wrong or bad. Instead, we talk about why these narratives are so popular and how they flatter a dominant culture audience. Then we talk about ways they might be limited in their perspective or how they might exclude some perspectives. Why are your immigrant stories, why do they always involve being on a big ship? You know, why not a small boat? Why not an airplane? Or why is it always Ellis Island? Why not Angel Island? With romantic comedies, students start to notice that certain types of women's behavior are rewarded in the framework of this archetypal narrative, while other types of women's behavior are punished. So it might tease out a way that students see patriarchy in the film. So this kind of approach gets students to understand how narratives can be limiting, how narratives can flatter one group while excluding another group. And again, it also invites us to think about why we might like these narratives. I tend to enjoy that archetypal immigrant story or the typical rom-com. And I think there's this tendency to assume you have to feel bad for liking one of these types of stories. But really, it's just about seeing a bigger picture and being able to think critically about them. This works in other disciplines as well. If I were teaching an economics or finance class, I might ask how a person goes from working class to upper class. You know, what is the typical idea of how that happens in the US? What factors are involved? The idea is to engage the fairy tales of your discipline. So our fourth strategy involves engaging disciplinary debates. A few years ago, I was struggling with a group work activity in my American Literature Survey course. I would give a 15 to 20-minute lecture and spend the rest of the class on group work in which students applied the lecture terms to a literary passage in groups of 4 or 5. The problem was that this activity just didn't work. For one, the students seemed bored and disengaged from the learning process. I'd hoped that working in groups would strengthen connections within the classroom and enrich student dialogue. Instead, a typical group activity would begin with one student saying after 5 minutes of total silence, "So, what do you guys think?" They'd work through the concepts, doing what felt like the bare minimum of analysis, and I couldn't figure out why they weren't trying harder. I also noticed that when the groups presented their responses, it felt like they were venturing a guess and waiting to hear me say whether they were correct. After a few failed attempts with this model, I realized that, as I suspected, I did have a correct answer in mind. I wasn't really challenging the students to think like literary scholars or, more broadly, to think critically. I wanted to change both the rigor of the exercise and the level of student engagement. So first, I determined that the lectures might be hurting the engagement and momentum in the class. So I flipped the lecture and used Panopto to embed quizzes, which students could retake. Now class time could be used entirely for discussion and collaboration. Moreover, students came in having watched the lecture in a more accessible, inclusive format, and the quizzes established a basic understanding of the key terms and concepts. Second, instead of just having one group spokesperson, as I did before, I asked students to choose among several possible roles to play, some with verbal components and others with written. Now, instead of sitting in silence for a few minutes, once the groups were formed, students immediately began discussing what roles they preferred to play. Third, and perhaps most importantly, I made the prompts more challenging, experimental, and engaging. There were no right answers, only positions to take and defend with evidence from our class and the students' experiences. Here are a couple examples of group prompts. Many Americans feel pride in this country, yet we can also see the darker moments of U.S. history. Similarly, the authors we read this semester celebrate aspects of American culture, yet often challenge our claims to democracy and equality. How important is it to teach about the dark side of the U.S. to younger generations? What are the consequences if we only paint a bright picture of the past? Another example, the last Du Bois chapter focuses on the sorrow songs, which he argues have shaped American culture and specifically our popular music. Take a look at the song types that Du Bois lists. Can you think of contemporary songs, say late 20th century to now, that seem to be based on these song types? Why do you think these messages are so enduring? The prompts ask more of students in terms of their critical thinking and ability to make connections between classroom content and their own lives. They emulate some of the questions a literary scholar might ask. Moreover, many prompts build on earlier discussions from the semester as students integrate new content. Changing the activity in this way has transformed my class. Furthermore, my own role has changed. Instead of responding to correct their analyses, I often learn from them, seeing connections or new ideas that have never occurred to me. These types of prompts, open-ended, disciplinary, and without a single right answer, can work in any field, whether humanities, STEM, or another area.
So we'll be taking questions soon, so feel free to type any of your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll stop either after this strategy or the next if we have questions. Strategy 5, spark students' curiosity with inquiry-based learning. This is often abbreviated as IBL. At the end of the semester in my first year writing courses, students always say the same thing. Pardon me, students always say the same thing. Their favorite activity was writing a story about a bank account. This class is so engaging because of inquiry-based learning. This teaching method reverses the typical learning process by beginning with a problem. Students have to solve it before they even know the key concepts for that class day. In my lesson, students start with a unique text called Ordeal by Check, published in 1932. The text presents a list of bank checks written by the fictional Exeter family, but with no further explanation. And I first saw this activity when I was a freshman in high school, and my English teacher, Diane Harris, introduced it to us. So checks are written to a hospital, car repair shop, hotel, mortuary, and dozens of other people. Students use these clues to create a narrative of what they think happened to the family. When we discuss their stories, none of them are identical, but there's a lot of overlap. For example, when a man buys lingerie and flowers, they assume he has a wife or a mistress. Tony Spagoni receives several checks, and for students, he becomes a mob boss, a hitman, or a bookie. I next ask students to explain how they came to these conclusions. How did they figure out what they think happened? And they say things like, a lot of it comes from the media. I was thinking of stories I'd heard before. I was basing my assumptions on things I was familiar with, like stereotypes. At the end of the lesson, I explain there's no true solution to the checks. The activity is not about what happened. It's more about how we figure out what happened. For example, our stories reveal problematic assumptions about women and Italian Americans alongside common narratives of marriage and childbirth. And that's where I teach the concept of intertextuality. I show students that language carries baggage. We interpret things based on stories we've heard before, and that's not a neutral process. We can see the stereotypes and the implicit bias in our thinking directly. Exercises like this immediately engage students in constructing their learning. This can nurture a growth mindset. The goal is to provide a supportive environment to engage prior knowledge, to make mistakes, and to struggle with new ideas. Normalizing error in this way is particularly important for marginalized students who are more vulnerable to stereotype threat and imposter syndrome. To create these kinds of lessons in your classroom, consider the ideas students struggle with. those core things in a discipline? Is there a way to get them to see the errors in their thinking? I'm a humanist, but I still remember when my trig teacher worked out a lengthy problem on the board and the end result was 2 = 1. He purposely made this error to show that you can't divide by 0. IBL doesn't always have to have a surprise ending. There are many simple ways to use IBL that could work for many subjects, like teaching key terms and teaching writing. In those situations, you just gather 3 examples of a key term in action. So speakers using emotional appeals, for example, or 3 metaphors. I like to gather 3 examples of a particular writing genre, like a report or a history paper or a poem. Then ask students to analyze the examples. What patterns do they see? What is this type of writing for? Students end up identifying the common writing conventions they can follow themselves instead of an instructor simply providing a list of requirements. Instructors can increase the stakes of this activity by asking students to take on the role of evaluator. For example, in my technical writing class, students act as hiring managers reviewing job applications. In Professor Emily Whitman's class that you heard about earlier, students act as a committee awarding a literary prize. As IBL lessons, students craft selection criteria for themselves. And one of the great things is it opens space to interrogate these standards, to look at the ways they can be inequitable and exclusionary. In Chapter 6 of our book, we provide dozens of different types of IBL lessons for a variety of disciplines.
Strategy 6, plan scavenger hunts. Oh, I'm sorry, Emery, are we stopping here to take some questions?
I didn't see any questions yet in the box. Mike?
Yeah, and I will encourage everyone, if you should have questions, again, put them in the Q&A chat. I've seen a few that have popped up in the audience chat as well that have come up, particularly, Lauren, your question about teaching underrepresented or non-dominant narratives. And if you could, expand on any strategies, particularly for teachers who are navigating contemporary challenges of teaching difficult subjects. Just additional approaches for effectively guiding students and recognizing and critically engaging with underrepresented narratives in a sensitive and empowering way. Again, considering socio-political restraints that they're dealing with now. If you have any additional recommendations for broaching those subjects for those who are really just breaking ground and navigating into these areas.
Absolutely. This is something that I'm actually going to put a resource in the audience chat.
Good
This
deal.
is
Thank
a
you.
resource I work on with my colleague, Cassandra Smith. So this is something that's very important to me. The idea, this is a website called Teaching Interventions, and on this website, you'll see a link to some scripts. So the idea with creating this website, and something that I think about a lot when I do that critical thinking exercise, is I'm trying to work against a social and political climate that's extremely polarized. Students kind of have been trained to receive any kind of social media, any kind of headline as sort of on their team or against them. And that is often echoed at home, that's echoed with their friend groups, it's echoed when they turn on the news. It's a very kind of team-based mentality. And it can really interfere with the ability for students to form connections to one another in the classroom, as well as to certain types of content. So one thing that I try to avoid is any situation where I'm specifically calling out a student or putting them on the spotlight for saying something that's offensive or problematic. But at the same time, if a student in the class might be harmed by a comment, I can't be silent either. So I try to take the comment or the problematic implication, as it sometimes is, outside of the student's domain and make it something we hear a lot. So a student says something like, we're talking about the romantic comedy, the archetypal romantic comedy story, and a student says, well, yeah, but women are obsessed with getting married. They are all looking for like long-term relationships, and men are not. And I'm not going to just say, that's pretty sexist. That's a big stereotype. But I might say something like, well, this is certainly the message we get from romantic comedies, and we also get it from these types of TV shows and these types of advertisements that we see all the time, and we're often told this by our friends. But how might that be a limited perspective? Do you think there might be any exception? And just kind of invite people to critically examine it without specifically targeting that student. So on the website I linked, teachinginterventions.com, we have a list of the types of harmful comments or the types of tense situations, things like microaggressions, and how to make those moves so that it becomes, on the one hand, you're protecting students who might be harmed by the comment, but you're also avoiding a situation where the student who has that view is going to dig in their heels and just get defensive and not open up to learning.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. And again, I encourage everyone, if you have any questions, enter them in the Q&A. We're now at the top of the hour, now we're at the top of the hour. So we're going to move ahead, and we'll bring additional questions to y'all attention a little bit later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll move on to the sixth strategy, which is planned scavenger hunts and other forms of experiential learning. A lot of you on that first polling question mentioned experiential learning activities as your most memorable learning experiences. So experiential learning is a hands-on approach to learning. Such techniques encourage students to connect what they do during class to what professionals do for a living or to a skill they'll need for navigating their post-graduation lives. Both experiential learning and IBL are good approaches for fostering student agency. Students participate in the learning process and construction of knowledge. If administered thoughtfully, it can help create a sense of community, especially if students are working together. This approach has cognitive benefits. Research has shown it's a way to get students to retain information stored in long-term memory and to apply knowledge. Incorporating experiential learning can be as simple as something like having students play games, conduct interviews, or do scavenger hunts. In one of my writing classes, students used to have a traditional library visit. They'd sit in front of computers while a librarian would walk them through search engines and databases. This involved a lot of content delivery, and many students would tune out. So one semester, I decided to shake things up. Instead of the library visit, I created a library scavenger hunt. I didn't give any overview, but told students they were welcome to ask for help at the information desks. Tasks included things like locating a physical book on the Harlem Renaissance, finding a census in the Ancestry database, locating a New York Times article about the 1929 stock market crash in the ProQuest historical newspaper database, among others. The winning team got something like an extra dropped quiz. Students were so into this exercise. They were excited and engaged, and for the most part, they were able to retain what they'd learned and apply it to their research assignments. And it is a form of IBL too, because I didn't give them the lesson up front. The lesson came from kind of experimenting, trial and error, and doing the activity. So there are ways you can combine experiential learning with forward-looking assessment. In a finance course, there might be a stock portfolio that students compile over the course of the semester and submit at the end. And so each unit might contain a lesson that will help them with a particular kind of investment. In a design course, at the end of the semester, they might have a home design client with specifications for designing a room or a house. And it might contain things like how to make something ADL compliant, or how to make something work with particular architectural elements, how to incorporate a particular design style, something like that. But units along the way teach the student these skills. And I mentioned this earlier, but in a lot of history or English classes, people use the game Reacting to the Past, which is essentially a role-playing game that consists of students using primary source materials to kind of understand the complexity and the different roles involved in a particular historical event. I did want to, one thing to keep in mind with experiential learning is that it's such an effective style of teaching, but it's also a practice in which you have to think more holistically about inclusion. For example, with reacting to the past, you don't want students imitating accents or dressing up as certain ethnicities. So you might need to provide some guidelines on the syllabus or just as part of the assignment. Also, if you require people to move around as part of an activity, are there going to be mobility barriers? For example, we need to check field trips for accessibility. Or in my scavenger hunt example, I always give the option of one student staying put to compile what other group members find. And this isn't just for mobility restrictions. Sometimes invisible disabilities like asthma make it difficult for students to walk around outside a lot. So as you explore this method, keep alternatives and accommodations in mind to make sure the activity contains the learning outcomes that you want it to and includes all students in the learning experience.
Strategy 7, share inclusive labor with students. One of the big fears instructors have about inclusive classrooms is that they create more work, and that really can be true. But if we share labor with students, we can also create a space where it's clear we are all responsible for more inclusive worlds. There are many ways to share labor. For example, you can task students with diversifying the curriculum. When I was in graduate school, my modernist literature professor assigned us to read early 20th century archives, and we had to find a little known text that we thought would widen the voices represented in our readings. So let me be clear, she did not teach a white curriculum and just expect students alone to be responsible for inclusion. Instead, she laid the groundwork in her readings and then showed us that as literary scholars, we were all responsible for the canon. Here's another example of sharing labor with students. A lot of classes use visual content like photographs, art, or drawing. We need image descriptions to support blind and low vision students, sighted students seeing something for the first time. It's not always clear what we're looking at. We may not understand if it's a graph or a chart, what the data is showing, and folks sitting in the back of the room. Teaching students to write descriptions is a really useful exercise that can build a class archive. When describing graphs and charts, students have to examine numerical evidence. With photographs of people, students must critically consider how to describe bodies, gender, race, and other identity markers. Image descriptions are a great way to share labor while also promoting a commonly overlooked accessibility feature. One final set of examples, students could craft community agreements. There are different approaches depending on what you're comfortable with students doing. Some instructors lead a class on civil discourse in which students write discussion guidelines. Some instructors ask students to co-author syllabus policies such as attendance, makeup work, and technology in the classroom. I like to start the activity by talking about a range of policies, important critiques, and our personal experiences with them. And then we have a dialogue about creating them. In my current course, students write their own team rules as they run an independent project. They negotiate roles, boundaries, internal deadlines, and other logistics. There's a sample of my team charter instructions in our book, and I've even put a page number in the access copy. Overall, redistributing labor helps make the classroom more inclusive. We cannot carry everything by ourselves until we are burnt out and resentful. As Bell Hooks explains, student contributions are resources, and excitement is generated through collective effort. Ultimately, inclusion is not made by one individual, it's made by a community. I'd like to stop. Mike, do we have a question in the chat? In the Q&A?
Yes, we do. There's a question from Sara. The question is how can we foster cohesion with group work if students are resistant to work together? I've had students that flat out refuse to work simply because they do not like their reading partner. So how do you foster that sense of cohesion, community, and collegiality among your students?
There are a few different ways. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Emery.
Lauren, you take it first.
Oh, okay. I have actually had this issue before, and it turned out that in this particular case, the student had a valid reason. But one option, and we talk about this a little bit in our book, is to mix up the groups to explain that you have, you're going to have different partners each time. If that doesn't work with the setup of your class, one thing we recommend is a group charter where you set certain, I would say, building structure into group work, which is what I did in that example I mentioned earlier when it wasn't working. Building structure might be something like setting ground rules or deciding when it's appropriate to contact the teacher or a professor. It might be having specific roles to play and agreeing on what those roles are. Things like that. If there's a student that's refusing to work with someone, sometimes that can just be a frivolous reason, and sometimes it can be something that is far more understandable. Maybe the student has said or done something to make them very uncomfortable, or maybe there's a history there that we don't know about. So I try to accommodate those concerns in a way that doesn't single out that particular partnership. So in that case, it might be necessary to switch up a couple of the groups rather than dealing with the resistance of a particular student. And of course, a lot of this is up to your discretion. If a student just wants to work with their best friend, and part of the point is getting them to get to know more of their classmates and to foster that community, you might have to do a little bit more on the front end of class to set up the scaffolding for the group work and explain you're going to be working, you're deliberately going to be paired with some of your classmates you might not know as well, and that's part of the purpose of this, and here's why. Give them that information earlier on. And with that kind of transparency and scaffolding, students tend to be a little bit more open to working with different people. Anne-Marie, I'm not sure if you had anything to add.
Thank you for sharing that experience. I really like what you're saying about prep work goes a long way and open dialogue with students. That's great. So we'll move on to strategy 8, be intentional, critical, and reflexive. The methods we promote today have worked well in our classrooms and are backed by research. We've noted dozens of studies in the workshop bibliography, which is at the end of your access copy, and hundreds in our book. But that doesn't mean they're flawless or that they work the same for everyone. Research on classrooms is conducted on specific student bodies within particular institutions at certain points in time. Each of us as educators must be reflexive in deciding what methods work for us and our students. For example, we live in Texas and Alabama, where our states have enacted anti-DEI laws in education. Teachers are considering what feels safe to teach in these contexts right now, and there really are no definitive answers. Our positionality, too, affects how we engage students. For example, many inclusive scholars recommend sharing authority with students. Yet instructors from marginalized communities already have our authority questioned due to systemic biases. It shows up when students directly challenge our authority and assign lower evaluation scores than they do for professors from dominant groups. That makes negotiating authority in the classroom complex. Of course, encouraging agency and providing choice and flexibility for students doesn't mean subtracting those things from instructors. Some practices are complementary. Community agreements, as I explored a moment ago, help many instructors, like Travella Pittman, who's written pretty extensively on this, feel they have more authority because they can point to a document that was co-written with students. In Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks emphasizes that valuing students' experiences and sharing responsibility with them can counter dominance inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and she talks about joy, in a recurrent way throughout the book. When we use a critical and intersectional lens to evaluate our practices, we also have to consider who we are teaching to and for. And these are types of questions that a lot of inclusive scholars ask. For instance, problem-based experiential learning is backed by research, but scholars have also shown that the problems instructors typically use focus on dominant culture. Group work can be an effective learning tool, but it can also create gender inequity when women students end up doing most of the administrative tasks, as has been demonstrated in college studies. Inquiry-based learning can lead students to discover ideas in dynamic ways. But lessons like disability simulations, or so-called empathy exercises, are destructive even when done with good intentions. All of our methods need scaffolding that requires us to understand where students are coming from. In our book, we cover each of these topics and many more to support instructors in making choices that are effective and inclusive for their class. Ultimately, there's no one way all teachers teach best, just as there's no one way all learners learn best. There isn't a checklist to follow because inclusive teaching is always an ongoing process that we're enacting. Here, we'd like to leave you with advice from Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better. To conclude, we'd love to use this space to learn more about the people, learn more from the people in the room. I know y'all have been busy on chat. I don't have the ability to read chat and present at the same time. So if we could crowdsource an answer to this question. What strategies do you prioritize to teach in a more inclusive way? So we're back on Mentimeter. There's a link in the access copy or the chat. You can also use the QR code or go to menti.com, Holl code 5556-4933. And the question is, what other strategies do you prioritize to teach in a more inclusive way?
All right.
So we already have some answers here. Differentiated teaching, that's not a term I'm as familiar with, but I think it's important for K through 12 educators. So please in the chat, someone fill in a little bit more about that. Multimodality, asking open-ended questions. A physics teacher, my physics teacher used I don't know this word either, Van de Graaff generator, and that really stuck with me because he was so excited about it. Oh, I think some of these answers might have been to the first question. My apologies. I'm going to wait for a moment longer for answers to this question.
Someone in the chat mentioned being intentional, and I think that's such an important point. There's, I think there's a sense that sometimes we get so busy that we're kind of teaching the way that we were taught, you know, without really thinking what we want to accomplish, what our dream scenario for a class would be. Being intentional just allows you to think about what's important to you as teacher and what's important to you for your students to get out of the class.
Yeah, I'm seeing answers like connect with students, providing manipulatives, like hands-on activities in a math class, being student-centered, interrogating my own biases, being accommodating and supportive to the needs of students. I prioritize scaffolding the most. I have students who have achieved mastery and others that need a lot more one-on-one support. Use of podcasts to offer non-dominant perspectives before students do a role-playing exercise. They're more willing to offer different views. Being aware of all my students' backgrounds and situations. Incorporating technology, multiple modalities, giving students choices. Teamwork. Students don't always work well together, so encouraging it and providing opportunities to do so is imperative. Keeping in mind different learning styles. Be supportive, be present, student choice. Thanks. So these will be available to you after the webinar ends as well, so that we can continue to read each other's insights.
And we would love to use the remaining time to address questions that you all may have. We also just want to thank the National Humanities Center for having us, and thank you all for giving us your time and your participation. So, Mike, I'm not sure if there are any other questions in the chat.
Yeah, one question, actually maybe two. Anne-Marie, you mentioned positionality earlier. In terms of steps, strategies, how can educators, what recommendations do you have for educators to explicitly acknowledge and critically examine their own positionality to foster more equitable and inclusive learning environments? Do you have recommendations for that? Because that is so important, and you made reference to it when you were talking about strategy 8.
Yes. So I have a colleague named Leslie Ann Knoll. I used to work with at Tulane, and she has a version of a positionality wheel that I think is common amongst a lot of social justice educators. And the wheel asks, you can do this as something for yourself to like consider your own positionality. It's also something that can be brought into the classroom as a tool. And it is a series of items that ask you to consider your own, position within race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, the socioeconomic status you inhabit now, what you grew up inhabiting, how many, what languages do you speak, what is your home life like? There's a number of questions that each person uses to kind of really think about their positions of where they might occupy privilege and also when they might be in a minoritized group. So I find that's really useful it's not something I ask students to share aloud in class, but I find that it's really useful to get people to think about things that they might not think about. For example, if a white student doesn't necessarily think about their race as part of their identity, a positionality wheel directly forces you to answer this question, what is your race, ethnicity? And so it's like forcing dominant identities to not just be normalized, but to have to be spoken and stated. So that's one activity that I think is interesting for class and to think about our own positionality. And I'm also thinking about, Chavella Pittman has a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education where she talks about, we kind of think of instructors and teachers as having this force field, where their authority is honored. And that force field really works best for people who are in dominant identities. And so there are so many different ways that our identities can interact and intersectionally affect us. But to me, that metaphor just feels really useful and has been one that I've used in conversation before to to really recognize when there are instructors who do not have the protection of that force field. And in particular, in moments when we're teaching content like social justice content, asking students to challenge their own biases, that makes us more vulnerable in the first place. So considering how much vulnerability you can sit with in a particular class or a particular semester, I think is a really wise thing to do. And sometimes it makes people almost too scared to take on more flexible teaching strategies. But at that point, it can be helpful just to think of small moves. If you create a few extra days that people can use towards deadlines to turn in work late, is that really going to compromise your authority? Maybe not. Personally, I don't think so, but for some people it might. So kind of taking each new strategy that you might try to use to work toward an inclusive classroom and considering how it might affect your own vulnerability in the classroom or privilege in the classroom.
Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you so very much for that. And we have a few more moments, but I'm interested in hearing if you both could speak to the projects that you're working on. I would love to hear more about, just tell the audience a little bit about what to expect with your teaching with disability. I know we covered a number of these topics tonight, Anne-Marie and Lauren, the Eco-Critical Project, A Planet in Hospice. So do you mind taking a few moments, both of you, to speak to those and just give an idea of, when to expect that or ways that they can engage with those materials?
Lauren, are you okay with going first?
Sure.
Okay.
So the Eco-Critical Project is part of a body of literary studies work that I do that tends to focus on how people construct American identity, and in particular, how different groups kind of compete to construct that national identity. For example, dominant groups and historically marginalized groups, or groups that want to be good allies but often perpetuate, the status quo or some version of settler colonialism. So these are things that interest me in my literary research, and of course, they permeate my pedagogical interests as well. So this project started with one of my favorite classes to teach, which is on post-apocalyptic or dystopian literature. It's really popular with undergrads. A lot of them grew up reading Hunger Games and things like that, and so they read 1984 in like the 9th grade and found it a big page turner. So they get to this class, and what I have found is that more recent works of these genres, which are often written by women, by African American women, by Indigenous and First Nations writers, they are reflecting a very different type of apocalyptic narrative. So there's often this environmental justice dimension to it. So this has become kind of a new way of talking about a lot of the issues that have come up in this webinar, how we decenter dominant narratives, how we think about things from a different subject position or different subjective position. Even something like the environmental movement or something like national parks, we tend to think of as just good and progressive, and everybody likes national parks. But we don't see that in creating national parks, we forced a lot of Indigenous tribes to leave their home territory and go somewhere else, so that we could have these places as sort of leisure tourism spots to go and visit and hike, mostly for people who can afford to do so. So that's just an example of some of the things I'm interested in right now, and they're things that I bring into my oh, sorry, I'm seeing some good reading suggestions in the chat. There are things that I'm bringing that kind of transcend that sort of pedagogical research and the literary studies research that I do.
Thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate that.
So my book project, Teaching with Disability, is about a way of teaching that acknowledges disability as a constant presence in our classrooms and our students and instructors like me. And it's about teaching with the knowledge that we gain from disability, so disability studies, disability activists, like the actual lived experience of disability. I started writing this a long time ago. So in 2017, I created a website with some students at Tulane called the Accessible Syllabus Project. And our goal was to look at this one document, the syllabus, and try to figure out how it could be more accessible and accommodating to students. And since then, I've gotten a chance to work with educators at different workshops. And when they talk about pedagogical problems, I just keep seeing accessibility problems. And accessibility problems really need disability studies. So I'm thinking of questions like, how can we plan a class that accommodates a wide range of abilities? How can we design a syllabus that students actually want to read? How can we create image descriptions for a whole class archive of really dense visual content? How can we teach difficult content in accessible ways? And this kind of using disability knowledge can enable us to create better access in classrooms. It's still in progress, but I'm hoping to get the proposal together this summer. And I'd also like to have a book done before I send it out, because it takes a little bit of the time pressure that I feel off of me. So hopefully I'll have a whole book sent out with the proposal by the end of the summer. We'll see.
Good deal. Thank you so very much. And speaking of the summer, as I read in your introduction and I mentioned, we will see you at the Graduate Student Summer Residency. When I did my introduction, I mentioned to you all that Anne-Marie is a friend of the program, longtime contributor, co-director of this initiative, the Graduate Student Summer Residency. And so we're incredibly fortunate to have her and to be able to work with her. So thank you for that. And I believe you have the final slide here. I'll drop some book links here, your website links, I would say, in the chat as well. So any closing remarks?
Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late at the end of the semester, and I just appreciate your time and the expertise you all contributed.
Yes, and thank you so much for your participation. It's very heartening seeing so many people engaging on the chat and in the polls, and it makes it just a more fun learning experience for us as well. So thank you for that. And Mike, thank you for organizing this.
Absolutely. I look forward to continuing our conversations as you roll out your book projects and continue this incredible work that you all are doing. Just know that we appreciate you. As you can see, the chat is moving along pretty quickly because everyone is saying thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, your work is based in a college environment, but there's so many universal connections, to say the least, here. And you made it clear, you made it plain, you made it accessible to everyone here tonight, and everyone truly enjoyed engaging with you both. And as I mentioned to you all earlier, this is the next to the last webinar that we will have for the 25-26 season. And so for all that's happening at the National Humanities Center, again, check us out, nationalhumanitycenter.org, or on our various social media channels. Support the humanities education programs. We provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. So we will be back May 6th for the final webinar of the season. We will be joined by Diane Muddy-Burke, Professor of History, Co-Director of the Center for Digital and Public Humanities at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, for Kansas City and American Crossroads. May 6th, back here, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You all enjoy your weekend. I hope that it is restful and restorative. Only one day away, and many of you all will be facilitating and giving end of course exams, preparing for much needed summer breaks, and sending your students off into the world for graduation. So again, we have one more. If you should have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to reach out to M. Williams at nationalhumanitycenter.org. And a special shout out to Zoe and Sara, who were in the chat tonight, moving the conversation along. I have, enjoyed working with you. I consider myself fortunate to know you both. And again, we'll be chatting, and I will see you all very soon. Everyone, take care, be well, and please know that I appreciate you more than you know.